The C minor from Book 2 starts with a prelude also like in Book 1 with 16th notes flow. This time with alternation of hands. So in fact, you have very few sections where the 16th notes are together in both hands. Most of the time the 8th notes listen, 16th notes speak, and inverted. And then 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And the left hand in 8th notes also 2, 3, 4, 1. Well, it doesn't have to have this slur per se, it can be just in the impulse. In the Baroque music, you don't have to always define something and follow it because it becomes too structural. I think it should be also, that portion should be left to the impulsive element of the spark of the moment. You can do equally detached but with impulses. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Or you can do it legato. Or then you can combine. Some and some not, and mostly the slur of beat, which helps with that constant rebouncing of the beat. Mi sol do re do si la, so si re mi re do si mi la do mi fa mi re do fa si re fa so fa mi re mi. And when the two hands play the 16th notes together, it's an illusion of accelerando because it's busier. So he alternates the dynamic dialogue between 16th in one, 8th in the other, and vice versa, or then all of a sudden 16th in both, when he reaches the punctuation. For that purpose, it cannot be played too slow, in my opinion, because if you do, it's not forbidden since with no indication of tempo or any mood. You can decide it according to what type of genre you imagine, if it's articulation toccata. If you want to bring out the two hands tenths, then you bring out and you play softer the other 16th notes. You can give the illusion of the tempo without the fast tempo. What you don't want is to take a tempo which you cannot hold, either because you slow down, either because you rush. It has to be a tempo that can be rejuvenating its beat, re-energizing its beat, re-initializing its energy, the constant relaunch of the drive. But not mechanically with beats and accents, but of the beat. La sol, la do, fa sol, re, sa mi, sol, la si, mi. So perhaps it can be played according to the tempo, not too fast, but fast enough to have a flow of 4 beats a phrase. 1, 3, 4, 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 1. Of course, you can also combine it when it's a long sequence like this, or 2 bars, 8 beats. I just naturally did the crescendo because it's an ascension. But sometimes you have to allow the music to say it without you over announcing it or overwhelming it with your own personal expression of drive forward up. You can play just equal dynamics. And let the music itself arise. And if you help it with your crescendo on top, and you play it fast, it becomes a racetrack. Of course it's exciting too, but I think it's less rich in inner details. Let's say if I played very vindicative and fast as a character choice. Or I don't think slower is as convincing, even if in different aspects. Freedom exists. You don't have to think is only one way. I just think that it has to be always a combination that corresponds to what inspires you in the piece, call it inspiration, intuition, drive, and what you do according to what you read of the score with the different complexities. Because if it's too fast, you erase the details, and if it's too slow, you lose the direction, arrival point, the aim. Has to be a very subtle balance of this flow in a way that is reaching its point while enjoying the details on the way. For the fugue, it's very important to play the second eighth note a little more, because before the silence of the piece, which is interrupted by a note, there is a silence before the note, which nobody knows because it's silence. When you hear the answer, it's clear. Because it's not downbeat in the beginning, make sure the E flat speaks more than the G and not, because that will give the illusion to the listener that it is the downbeat on which you start. It's 1, 2, 3. And I know it's obvious because you read it on the music, but you have to make it readable through your playing. Finally, the fourth voice. Now, it is true that if Bach uses a bridge or a codetta to connect elements, he usually uses material that's already existing, because that's how he constantly works on recycling thematic materials, which gives a unity to the piece. If the sections that we call sometimes for that purpose, in French, divertissement, which puts you in away from the element, it's just an escapement, I would like to call it so in French, if it's translated from it. But in English it's called an episode. And I was told to play very intensely the subject, the answer, the entrances, the exposition, but when I have these bridges, I should play a little bit softer touch in order to make sure that the audience understands this is not yet the thematic material. But you know, with age I find that this is a little bit overstated, because then it's too hierarchized. Of course, that's the subject. That's the answer. And then you have the bridge in syncopations of suspensions. And that's where you realize the musicians who follow the voicing and the other, and they kiss together in dissonances that are corresponding to the tension release of the suspensions in syncopation. And because they're so close, the two voices, it's easy, if you're not attentive in the voicing, to hear a combination of both. Of course, you read it with the stems up and down, but when you play it, it shouldn't become combined. So that's why I have to choose one voice to play louder than the other. It's like, what happens to the first voice when the third voice enters? Mi, re, sol, fa, mi, re, do, mi, re, sol, fa, mi, re, sol, do, si, do, re, mi, fa, si, la, fa, do, si, la, si, fa, mi, re, si, fa, mi, re, do, si, la, sol. Si, mi, fa, si, do, fa, mi, re, do, re, do, si, do, fa, si, la, sol. Re, mi, fa, mi, sol, do, si, si, la, sol, si, mi, re, do, si, la, si, do, fa, sol, fa, sol. I'm not going to impose you more of my singing horrible voice. But what I wanted to bring out is that when you bring one and you play the other in the right hand, in this case, you really hear them for what they are individually. You cherish them, you bring them, you follow them, you enjoy them. The suspensions or the scales. And then the other voice imitates the scales, but is not the same voice. And if you're not careful, that's what you always hear, mostly the time hear, because the instrument blends the elements in the same range, unless they're really separated. And why do I think the tempo for this fugue should be moderato? Is because I think there is something, well, most 16th notish, a lot of it is 8th notish. It's more on the peaceful side for me, rather than, if I imagine a different character for interpretation, I could do something. I tried to convince myself to be convincing, but no, I like it. Or too much, isn't it? Too much brought out. It has to blend without to blend. Like the Italian Renaissance painters, chiaroscuro, light and dark, or light and shadow, but not very dark and very bright, because then it distracts. Actually, it's the combination of the voices, even if you bring out some. At all levels, it has to be very carefully organized in your mind that you play 4 voices, not just a combination of voices according to the long and the short notes. Because when you hear in the bass, then in the middle voice, and then the entrance of the subject, it can be, it has to be differentiated. open a score of Bach and you look at the music, first thing you observe is the kind of texture that you observe by the rhythmic patterns. If you are 16th notes, 8th notes, quarter notes, not that they are always the same, but very often they give you an indication of 16th notes being Bach's main engine that continuously flows. And then you have the 8th notes that decorate or comment or accompany the speaking 16th notes, as if they say ha 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 ha, while the other one is speaking. And if he combines them, then you have to know if he intended it or he didn't. For instance, in the C sharp major now of book 1, clearly the right hand talks, the left hand listens until the dominant is the inversion, and then you go to the D sharp minor, so you do the different fifths on which you modulate, and then A sharp minor, he could have continued like that, but he doesn't. Usually not more than a third reproduction of a pattern, of a sequence, but he's the right to also contradict that opinion. But generally in the observation he doesn't do beyond. Perhaps because that's another rule to anticipate or to surprise, to organize, but to remain impulsive. I think it's very interesting, and that's why I find it so compelling, the way it's written, because, as Mademoiselle would say, if you don't like or understand the way it's written, don't play it until you play the way it's meant. And if not, write your own. Didn't shy. But when I play his, I have to not only be convinced, but to be convincing, because I'm convinced. And he notated it in 3/8. Now, nobody hears 3/8 when you play. They hear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Plus the 8-bar section of the first phrase, which would be, in fact, an 8 times 3/8 bar. Then the dominant, second degree, it's dominant. I must say that because he writes in C sharp major, and at the time, of course, in 1720s, when he wrote this, the well-tempered tuning was relatively a novelty, and much why he was exploring it. And therefore, in the old traditional tuning, you didn't tune to play in sharp keys like that. You played A in A, in E, in G, in F, in C, in D, in A, you know. But in F sharp, in G flat, in all this, you didn't, or very rarely. And so he's exploring the tonalities because the reproduction on A sharp minor, nothing but the spelling of A sharp minor is confusing for students, because usually you read at that level of sharps, it switches to flats in B flat minor in harmonically. And then you have sequences, and he's playing in C sharp major and all its secondary dominants as if it's C major. Then it would be D minor, and it would be A minor. Instead of that is A sharp minor. And I think it's very interesting because at the time he wanted to prove that you can explore as a harpsichordist for these exercises through these exercises, playing in keys you never played before, and so, or less, or if not very often. So this flow of 16th notes and the groupment of the 3/8 that he chose instead of 12/8 But the phrase is at least 2 bars of 12/8. Sorry, bar a beat. 1, 2, not 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, or 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 5, 2, 3, 6, 2, 3, 7, 2, 3, 8, 2, 3, 1. And if it's played fast, then the arpeggiation pattern in the right hand can blend in the resonance. I'm not sure he would have liked that, but perhaps he did, and then I will be in trouble. But I still think that even if he writes in short group of bars and then hyper metering over that, is also because he wants to bring the attention to each detail for each bar. And so how do you phrase the leap? That's very bowing like, or legato, or detached. But it's not eighth note with a rest and an eighth note, it's a quarter note and an eighth note, which brings the thirds or tenths. Sixth in the inversion, tenths, sixths. And in contrast, the book 2 of C sharp major, he has also 16th notes, but with stems up and down. I will play for you unvoiced, the right hand. So here mi, sol, do, sol, fa, sol, mi, sol, do, sol, fa, sol, mi, fa, la, do, la, sol, la, fa. But in the writing, you see, tight, 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 which means that the, with the lower stems, is not the part of the same. Now, if I separate as I did the top note in order to prolong its life longer in provision of the secondary voice complementing this leap, written an octave apart, it would be already clearer. But when it's in the same hand, most likely he imagined that it will blend with the decay of the quarter note and the 16th notes complementing each other. These three with these three, and this. So it could be a touch difference, or 2 and 2, or 2 in the middle and the 4. And every time you start organizing different creative ways of subphrasing the articulations, it brings the attention to the detail when the detail should be included in its noble expression into the line of the direction of the whole thing. It's always the micro and the macro. I would like to know if he wanted it to be blending purposely, ambiguously. It could be mi, sol, do, fa, la, do, fa, sol, re, mi, sol, re. And if I play the other voice, mi, sol, do, fa, la, do, fa, sol, re. And not mi, sol, do, sol, fa, sol, mi, sol, do, sol, fa, sol, mi, fa. This is a very important discussion. It looks anecdotic like that. You can say, after all, he wrote it, I'm supposed to play it. Articulation, contrast, or dynamic range contrast, or no contrast. If he really wanted, as I gave the example earlier, to separate them, not to be possibly also sounding as combined, he would have. So perhaps that's somewhere the playfulness, if I may say, perhaps in his desire to teach a student to think layers, and playing the same hand, they sound combined. And for the tempo, I think that because of the eighth notes of the repeated ones in the left hand, which pace, in the C sharp major of book 1, the pace is done by the harmonic change. And here it's by half bar. Full bar. I speak of the harmonic progression change. Full bar, half bar. Half bar, 5, 2, 5, 1 in the dominant. And I think this spacing of the opening repeated notes, I would play with legato for the changing note and not for the repeated note. Ta-dum, pa-dum, pa-dum. Not staccato but detached, and then slur for the melodic third down, up, 5/4, always first establishing the subdominant. So once you have in mind that you have 4 parts to manage, the bass that plays on the strong beats 1 and 3, the tenor that plays melodically off the beat, slur or not, or just impulse, depends of the taste, and then on the right hand, the combination or the two separated in their coloristic timbre. And you notice how by the time you bring out these differences that are superimposed, it becomes slow and heavy. And if you play it in a flow, the faster you play, the more you lose the individual articulations of the different layers. So in part it's like when you cook, you put the ingredients together to produce a taste, of which the ingredients can be tasted on the taste buds. But nevertheless, he wrote it, we play it. And for the fugue of book 1, he chose something extremely joyful. I cannot imagine it being slow because of the leap of the 6th up. Now you can phrase the end of the subject with the drops of the 7ths, or the opposite, the rising of the 6th, and bring that rather than why not? Or all detached. Detached with impulse. Or offbeat impulse. And it doesn't mean or can be infinite. It means that you have at some point to observe what you can do when you combine them, for instance with the second voice. Or the third voice. Could it be more perky if it's faster? This almost sounds like a decoration that is a written out turn, or a mordant with under. In this tempo it sounds ta 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 ta, 16th notes, but if you play faster, then the decoration becomes almost a written out ornamentation. C-sharp major in book 2, 20 years later, he writes something in 8th notes, which is not so often the case at the first exposition, and then he ends up in 30 seconds, so you have to take that also in account. therefore it's 4/4. It's not 1, 2, 1, 2. It's 1 and 2. And when you read the ending, because it's tiratas, glissando like. So you have to plan for those 30 seconds so that you don't play too fast. Even if it's relatively empty or naked in the opening compared to the. I like to present for you today, as I do, these sonatas. Scarlatti wrote so many, but he didn't call them. They were exercizi, exercises. Bach wrote them as prelude and fugues. And I wonder if during the gap between the 20 years he had forgotten which he wrote in which key in book 1, though he was teaching it. Probably he didn't forget. But some of the fugues, for instance, in this case, of the two books 20 years apart, seem to share the same perky, positive, very joyful, jubilant mode. And some are very contrasting. So I don't know if he was trying to look at an old score and say, hey, what did I write to write something different? Or he just wrote his inspiration. He didn't need to be justified to be different from book 1, nor not. The only thing which I noticed, but I'm sure I'm not the only one, I just mentioned it on the way, is that the preludes of book 2 are most of them with 2 halves and a repeat in the middle, just like a Scarlatti sonata, my Freudian slip earlier. And book 1, almost none. So it could be that it was the style of the day that he wanted to perpetuate. And equally so, when you return to C sharp minor, because since every tonality has a major and a minor prelude and fugue, if you observe the C sharp minor of book 1 written in 6/4, could have been 6/8, could have been in 12/8, in 12/4, in 18/4, in 18/8, but I think it's a very graceful lament. And the Siciliana of the book 2. Dominant of book 1. It's really an aria. And to save my life, I wouldn't be able to play it faster. I don't know how to be convincing. Still carrying that nobility of the contemplative and elegant display of an aria, as well as the expressive gestures of the leap of the octave after the dropped tetrachord. Third reproduction of the pattern in the relative major. Here he starts left hand. So sometimes I think one, and in my case, is prisoner of first impression. That's how I met this prelude, if I may speak of the prelude as a person. Singing and lyrical, romantic if you want to call expression over form, as if it's a free song. Do, si, do, mi, no, sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, la, si, re, sol. To me it sounds nostalgic, but perhaps not to him after all. I'm in a different time period, even if I try to immerse in his flow of expression of emotion through these imitations. Of the second Rachmaninoff concerto seems to have the same Bachian patterns of arpeggios becoming chordalizations, and that flow in a uninterrupted elegance. And so does the book 2. Siciliana, which have been this dotted rhythm in 9/8, tam, patam, pam, like Mozart's 488 slow movement. Tim, patam, pam. So you have a few of them that are dotted rhythms in his book 2. Tilting is cradling. If you play it faster, you have to be very careful that the 16th notes don't become too loud because of the percussive instrument, by essence, that the piano is, or play them softer. To avoid that impulsive. It's really dense. You can see that generous usage of ornamentation and chromaticism, the sophistication in the expression, and the desire to bring some kind of elegance to each voice, the bass, the soprano, and the middle voice. And this three is like a trio sonata: gamba, flute, oboe, or perhaps violin and da caccia. It's more stylized, and I think that in my taste, when I see a 9/8, I phrase it exactly and articulate it like a bowing of a cello or da gamba. Out of the three, two tied and one detached. If I separate too much, the third beat, ta 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 ta, the short note becomes a character issue, which is a problem too, to be taken in account. The long one can be overlapping and becoming over legato. And the eighth note coming as a release after the tension of the quarter note, ti dum pa dum pam. On the piano, on the modern piano, can become like a hiccup, da, 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 even if you naturally want to bring some air to break between the notes and not play everything legato. Though it's aesthetically beautiful on the piano, but doubtful for the style of the time. But nevertheless, it can be considered so, especially if you add also the ornaments and a little bit of rubato. Oh, the word I shouldn't have used, right? A little bit overstay on some weight of tension and then lighten up the release, and so you can stay longer when you have the 7/6 suspension. And then let the 16th notes flow forward. So you can hold back on the suspension and go forward in the release of the tension. If you do it too much, it sounds like you're drunk. Of course, that's just for the purpose of the example, not to fall. But I think if it's strictly in tempo, it's a very correct recitation of the text. But if you feel the flow and the long and the short, and you go for the downbeat notes, the C sharp, the D, the G sharp, the F sharp, and you make your shape. Even the repeated notes are melodic, because each of them is a little more than the other, tom, pom, until the dissonance. So fourth ballade by Chopin, again, the 18th century, 19th century one. Of course, because he was looking back into Bach, and I think that we are accepting rubato in Chopin for the expression, but I don't think we openly accept today rubato in Bach, except if you play it on instruments of the time period and a certain way of bowing and certain way of expressing the heavy from the light note, the beats, the passing tones, the appoggiaturas, the ornamented decorations, there's so many things happening. Not every beat is the same. This one is without. This is with. And this is a suspension released on the second beat, which creates a tension because it's a syncopation. So you have 1, 2, 3, and here is a 2, 3, 1. Every group of 3 beats of 9, 8 with 3 8 notes in each beat are differently subdivided in the flow. And this swaying has to be so minimal not to be exaggerated, but also to be there tastefully according to everybody's conception of the good taste. And when you have voices, for instance, the middle voice comes after the held F sharp in the top voice, so you can hear with the decay a combination to avoid that by bringing out the top louder in order to bridge through the decay. This way, don't allow the listener to think that this becomes this. It returns. These things are important because I think we have the responsibility of the as performers, of course, to play our expression or what it means to us, but also to be very stern with the elements that are constitutive. After all, you don't play just your feelings, you also play the structure, the organization, the voice leading. You have to be having such an integrity that you don't hold back from over-involving, but you don't over-involve in a way that you make the piece too heavy to carry you and it falls, or you become too heavy to carry it. I don't know which way, but one way or the other you can consider that you should remain uninvolved with too much subarticulations, or then more involved. The example of book 1, of course, is the 5-voice fugue with the first subject with long values, all half notes and quarter notes. Then the second theme, snake-like or ornamental-like decorations, drops by a flow of eighth notes. It plays 8 or 4 notes compared to the whole notes or half notes of the subject, which is so stretched. And then there is a third thematic material that has the playful leap of the fourth, repeated notes, and then the syncopation leading, if you consider it so, or repeated, into the appoggiatura instead of the suspension. But in any case, compared to the long vowels of the long values, like vowels, and then the very short flowing, and then the second of the, or third new theme. And so he combines them almost constantly once they all arrive around the end of the first page. So you have the theme in F sharp minor, the subject, forgive me. Then you have the second subject in the same hand, and then you have the third all together on top of each other. It's very confusing at the first look, because the texture is very dense, and the fact that you have to organize these different levels of thematic materials from whole half notes to eighth notes to quarter notes in combination every time, that the rhythmicity of their individuality makes them recognizable even when combined. That is a fugue for a lifetime, because no matter how many times you observe, you notice how the voices, like fishes in a tank, they never collide. They always bypass each other harmoniously, in good behaving. And in book 2, he decided to write a 12/16, not by 3 but by 12, and without rhythmic patterns, so it could be considered as a fast tempo if you want to play something toccata like. Or you can do legato. Legato with detached. It's a bit overstaged. It's almost like colorizing it in a way that it's not meant to be, because after all it's written for a single timbre instrument, the harpsichord, even if it's meant to develop the hearing of the performers through studying it in layers. And of course, if you can have fingers for this, but I compare it to G sharp minor from book 2 in equal eighth notes, and I think it's lower because they're not 16th notes. Now what if he had notated I would have perhaps played it faster too, like this. And if this was notated in eighth notes, I might have done this. Now in book 1, I have all of the values, the long, half and whole notes, and then they have the eighth notes, and then I have the quarter notes repeated. So perhaps in book 1 I have less choice of tempo, because I have such variety of volume of expression, of exponential stretching between a whole note and an eighth note, or a bundle of eighth notes for a whole note. Whenever here I only have 16th notes and 8th notes for the whole fugue. So it's more limited in variety, but at the same time it doesn't suggest if it's supposed to be moderato, allegro, moderato with phrasings or articulations. But if you play now, I don't know, but to a certain extent, I assume that Bach wanted to develop through his teaching of these pieces, regardless that you have to play already in unusual tonalities like C sharp minor, which was at the time completely terra incognita for harpsichordists. Therefore, they had to find fingerings and how to play with all these black keys, mostly predominantly. But on the other hand, for the mood, the character, the setting, the interpretational genre that you have to come to define if it's a toccata, if it's an aria, if it's a voice invention in 2 or 3, if it's a French overture, if it's a Siciliana dance, if it's a sarabande. Perhaps more so for the preludes, but even in the fugues, you have to give them some kind of, not give them because they already have it, but you have to bring in through your performance some kind of a character that you decide from the get-go it will be, and you maintain it with your conviction to be convincing. That's why it's rhetorical, that's why it's eloquent, and that's why it's persuasive. It's all about being able to either convince by the detached touch, either by the legato light, and if you combine it with the fugue, then you bring a tapestry of your own choice of touches, of emotions, of expressions that are embedded in this inevitably mostly contrapuntal texture. But it does carry a level of... I think Bach's fugues, beyond their incredibly knowledgeable combination of voices, is also an exploration of character of music. So it's pure music by essence. It's not a dance and it's not a song, but it could remain also with different points of view, and you can be equally convincing if you are and you practice it towards that with the fingerings that are appropriated, to play it faster or slow if it means to you or your teacher or your musical advisor, because after all, the companionship of these pieces is that they teach you not only the piece itself through the way it's notated, is how you start understanding the toolbox that they were using when they were composing, Bach and of course his contemporaries, or how people who were studying them were playing them, in learning how to organize this, how to organize that, in the independence of fingers, in the dependence of voicings, in the independence of pulses, in the independence of combination of elements, especially in the fugues with the strettos, but even in the preludes. So I think it was a way to teach not only, but through Klavier, as they call it in German, keyboard technique and velocity, which it was the purpose of also. It was to teach you how to manage all these voice leadings. I think for that, probably these pieces were meant to be exercises of intuitive and educated intelligence spark.